Hello, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. I'll be introducing today's speaker, who is Amanda Ost. She is currently, sorry, give me just a second. She is currently the diabetes educator coordinator for nutrition education and eating disorder dietitian at Northwest Texas Healthcare Systems in the Department of Nutrition Therapy Services in Amarillo, Texas. She completed her Bachelor's of Science, Food and Nutrition and Dietetics at Abilene Christian University and received her Master's of Science in Nutrition at Texas Tech University, and also completed her dietitian internship there at Texas Tech University. So today she will be presenting Carb Counting Diabetes Management's Best Friend. Just some CME stuff to get out of the way. None of the planners and faculty for this educational activity have any relevant financial relationships to disclose with ineligible companies. And I will be posting the code later in the session towards the end for attendance credit. And I will also be sharing some resources, some handouts for Amanda today. And I will let her take over. We still have people trickling in as they're coming out of clinicals.
Okay. Hello. Let me get it set up. Okay, should be set up now, right? Okay, well, I'm happy to be here with you all. I'm in Amarillo today at Northwest, and happy to talk to you about carb counting. I'm sure most of you are familiar with carb counting. It is definitely the most asked question I receive from patients and providers. There's a lot of confusion. And hopefully I can provide some clarity, some really simple tips and some suggestions, but this is definitely how I feel about it, that carb counting is diabetes management's best friend. So we want to feel confident and comfortable when we're talking about it with our patients. Of course, nothing to disclose. What I'd like to achieve with you guys is just to really remind and identify fuel sources that are going to affect our blood glucose, practice some carb counting, and really learn how to utilize with insulin and managing our glucose. Really want to practice to where we can feel comfortable with this carb counting. Because if we're not comfortable, we're not going to be able to talk to our patients about it, correct? So first and foremost, we want to identify those fuel sources. Now, a lot of what I explain to providers that in education, our role as providers and clinicians is to not just prescribe and discuss their ailments, but also educate them on what's happening in their body. And nutrition is obviously really confusing, a lot of conflicting opinions, new data always, but we want to just start with the basics. And this is how I try to educate patients. I really try to simplify the process, help them comprehend in a real simplistic way what's happening in their body. So understanding that calories equal energy, they're fuel for your body, that calories are not bad, but that calories are the energy that runs your body. And there are three main sources that we utilize within all the foods we eat: carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And I break it down even more simplistically for patients that carbs are your main fuel function, main energy source. Protein's going to do a lot of things, but basically repletion, rebuilding, restoring. And fat, in that mono poly era stage of that, we call that protectant. So see how I just really keep it simple for patients and hopefully for you guys as well. Just another little tip. This is something I use a lot with patients that I thought might be helpful as a visual as well. the journey of food. You can kind of see in my office here, I have a version of it, and I make the patients process it with me, but we don't learn these basic nutrition tips. So use samples like this, examples like this with your patients, clinicians, if you can. But start with a plate of food. It's building blocks of carbohydrates, fats, and protein. We then chew it up, hopefully, and then that food ends up in our stomach and it's broken down into a smaller form: glucose, lipids, amino acids. And from there, our fuel moves through to our cells. Ultimately, the glucose is trapped in our bloodstream. We need to utilize our pancreas's production of insulin to help that glucose get into the cells. Looks like one of my animations broke on me, but the goal is to get here to help them understand, help us all understand this is the main fuel for our entire body, especially our brain, all of our organs. So we want to make sure we're getting adequate carbohydrates. So also reminding ourselves that carbs and protein, we get that same amount of calorie per gram of food. Fat, is just extra dense. A little bit goes a long way. So explaining that, reminding ourselves that carbs are our main fuel, protein and fat are a backup source. They have their own jobs they need to do, and they're essential. But it's very important that we remember and understand that the body needs each source of energy. We should really be mindful that we're not encouraging restriction of an entire group of food, but that we're being mindful of how much we're consuming possibly. So it's important that patients have a foundation that's not based in fear of their food, but that they understand that each source has a role within the body. So let's dig into our carbohydrates. This is one of my favorite SUME cards. They're not as popular now, I don't know if you all remember them in the early 2000s, but this is one of my favorite. Trust me, carbs are not your enemy. You need the fuel. And that's what we want to really be educating our patients on, that having this good foundation of understanding that they're our main fuel source and our body utilizes them with the combination of insulin, but they come in a variety of sources, that none of these foods are, quote, bad, but they all have the role of glucose within our body. Carb is a carb is a carb. But just like my board over there, each of these is going to be processed differently, starting in our mouth and in our stomach. And the timing and what else is involved with that food might vary, but once it hits that bloodstream, it is glucose, and we're going to need to match that up with insulin. So we want to remember this foundation of which foods are carbs, and I'm going to refer it to carbs a lot. So just so there's no confusion, carbohydrates are carbs. So the history of carb counting, I thought it would be beneficial to review how far we've come in this creation and utilization of carbohydrate counting. So in the pre-insulin world, I'm sure you're familiar, it was a very low survival rate, high death rate very quickly within diagnosis of a type 1 diabetes before we even really knew what was happening. Different means of practice, ways we tried to help these people survive was elimination, restriction, specifically of carbohydrates. They found, if we could eliminate these, they might live a little bit longer. But with time, we really learned and understood the body that elimination and restriction is really unsuccessful. And eventually we really have understood this necessary role of carbohydrates. So, we have this era of, last year was a 100-year anniversary of insulin. Diabetes has been in existence much, much, much longer than that. But even in that period of post-insulin, we still had this very cautious mentality with food. We didn't have a lot of resources with testing as well as medication. So diet was still very restricted and very cautious. From the 1980s to the 2000s, we began to know more information about what research studies, the DCC trial provided so much information for us about the effectiveness of intensive management. But during this era, it was still very specific, not user-friendly, even though we started to learn things about needing carbs. And then in the 2000s, we really started to see this as a healthcare community practicing that flexibility works best. So carb counting in today's life with diabetes is building meals and snacks for the real world, a process that's not going to just set someone up for failure, but understanding how to handle all situations. Like I mentioned, this intensive management approach really evolved in the 90s. If you're familiar with Jocelyn, he really is at the center of, he began practicing this troika in the 30s, where he was trying to utilize insulin, movement, and diet to create this philosophy of, if you know more, you'll be feeling better. You'll have a healthier life. The more we know, the better we will do. But he had this first approach of intensive management, and he was really frowned upon by many colleagues. They thought, no, it's better to just let someone live their life than force them to take more shots. When eventually he really had that, his theory was proven successful in that DCCT results really began that evolution of intensive management and that very individualized education. And it was around this time that we started to see the development of the diabetes educator, right? Jocelyn had really been the first one to, include that in the program team, but it wasn't until around this time that we started to see the CDE, right? The diabetes educator. And then in 1997 is when those ADA standards were created. We were able to diagnose diabetes, had a standardized care of treating, diagnosing, very specific recommendations on all areas of management of diabetes, which we then have updated every year, which is a wonderful resource and tool for all of us. But this acceptance of carbohydrates into the diet hasn't always been accepted. It hasn't been fruitful. If you remember, even though we knew we needed carbs, we were still very cautious as a healthcare community. We definitely, in the 80s and the 90s, where the focus was on, correct the impairment of the body's inability to use and store, retrieve carbs in the diet. There was a big division between starchy and simple carbs. And then we were also med driven during this time. The timing of insulin available at this time, we needed to plan our meals around that insulin in a more scheduled format. So we saw breakfast, lunch, and dinner around the same time every day, which we still know to this day that formality of routine is extremely helpful. But it was really focused around the timing of insulin during that season. Now we have much more rapid acting insulin, a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more freedom with food choices. So the more we know is very helpful for this individualized meal planning. So those in 1994 ADA standard of care, there was no specific diabetes diet created, which is kind of mind-blowing for a lot of us as practitioners that these standards did not include a specific percent of calorie distribution. There were definitely a lot of research studies that give us a lot of suggestions, and we still practice those, and we're always researching those. But there wasn't a particular food or group of food that we've eliminated within these standards. And that as a consensus has not changed. And what the standards still recommend is that we want to spread these carbs throughout the day for better glycemic management. We also want to not encourage less than 130 grams of carbs in a day. Obviously, that varies based on body composition and age. However, that is something we really want to let sink in, because in a carb unfriendly world, there's a lot of information coming at our patients and our families that carbs are the devil, carbs are the enemy. But instead, it's more likely the portion of the carbohydrates. It's what's more challenging for us is we have what I like to call sneaky carbs. We have carb portions that are growing in our home perspectives, in the restaurant industry perspectives. So we have a big shift in really understanding maybe what our body might need based on how it feels versus what we've been expected to think we need to have. So we get into what's recommended and what we can practice with patients is this basics of building a plate. So we used to use, the food pyramid. That was proven to be pretty unhelpful. But the plate method is really, I think, more user-friendly with anyone from whatever capacity of nutrition education they have. And of course, that My Plate government website is very helpful to just teach very simple practices with understanding there's room for everybody on my plate, and I need to try to get a variety, right? So when we're looking specifically at glycemic management, which is really not that different from any type of health management, is that we want to have at least half of the plate carbohydrates, half or fourth of the plate protein, and then trying to make half of our plate twice a day at least of some fruits and vegetables. That's a real generic, simple way to guide someone in making a plate. So that can be confusing when we think of the plate as being grains, dairy, fruit, and starchy vegetables, when all of those are carbs. So we want to get a variety of carbs, and we want to have an idea of portion, right? So that's the next step, is to understand portions. So we do something called carb counting, where we really want to understand portion sizes in helping us shape our plate in a way that's going to be more comfortable to our body, more helpful in the growth and maintenance of our body, as well as the function of our absorption of insulin, the effectiveness of our insulin when we have a functioning pancreas, or then the attachment of insulin that we have injected. So we want to have about anywhere from 3 to 5 servings of carbohydrates per meal. Of course, this is going to vary significantly based on age and body composition. Our younger lads usually need a little bit more. As we level out in our growth, we don't need quite as much. And then we want to have, like I said, 1/4 of the plate of protein, which looks about like 3 to 5 ounces, which is, 1 ounce of protein is going to be about 7 grams. So we want to think of it that way. And then this is an example. I think I've included that in the comments and can be emailed to you. This is a format I like to use a lot with my patients. That variety is the key when we're building a plate. I like to utilize that there's room for everyone on this plate, but if we do, for say, have a plate of just grains, or we have a plate of just protein, it's not so much that even that's the problem, it's that we're missing out on these other foods that have different options of fuel and bonus nutrients within them. So on the left side, we have, half of our plate are these carbohydrate options, which come from all of our grains, our fruits, our dairy, our starchy vegetables. And then we want to think about, if we're getting a variety, we want to try to work in as many of those as we can. If we're going to have starchy vegetables, that we're mindful to maybe not do starchy and non-starchy, not do starchy, but starchy, non-starchy. We still call them that, but what we really want to focus on, we'll get into that, is the makeup is a little bit different. So this is a tool that I thought might be helpful for you guys to have when you're educating patients. There's lots of versions of this. This is just one that I created and prefer. So we count carbs by counting by 15. I'm sure you've heard that. We start with the number 15 because it's a pretty generic looking serving size. Like 1 slice of bread is 15 grams of carbs. And also 15 is just easy to add. So we have 15, 30, 45, 60, 75. So we have 5 servings of carbs, or 3, 4, 5, right? So each family and person is going to have their own established perspectives, right, of what a portion is. We lay out a buffet of food. We're all going to select not only different foods, but also different quantities. And so instead of just rebuilding their entire life, let's give them the tools to understand, make the choices you want, but be mindful that the portion is the poison in anything, and that we get a variety, right? So understanding those carb portions is really the key to carb counting. So we want to get familiar with which foods are carbs. We want to really learn that 15-gram portions, some examples of that, have some prepared to provide our patients. And we want to see it on the plate. We want our patients to be encouraged with visuals, understand, okay, I can have such and such, but it has a spot on my plate. So jumping in, getting this carb counting going, move this over real fast. So if we're moving this carb counting over, sorry. Okay. We have our grains. This is the first one we're going to think about. So traditionally in our culture here in West Texas, we see wheat, oats, and rice are the big 3 we tend to utilize. Obviously, we have a very diverse culture, so we have other options, but those are the big 3 that we tend to see the most. Wheat, of course, we make flour with, and it's a wonderful resource. It's inexpensive. We can do so many things with it. Again, the portion is the poison. So if an individual is very excited to have slices of bread on their plate, that can quickly become all of the carbs their body can handle before they've even considered other foods, right? So we want to think about all of the things we make with flour, all the things we make from that would include, bread, crackers, some cereals, Eggos, pancakes, biscuits, pasta, so many things we make with flour. Rice is also a very generalized ingredient. We can add so much to it, right? And then our oats can be in a lot of traditional forms as well. So on the page, on this slide, I have listed some food items and then what a 15-gram portion would look like. And as you can imagine, like slice of bread is pretty simple. We can kind of get that. Rice and pasta, they're more nutrient dense. So just a 1/3 cup is going to be 15 grams of carbs. Tortillas are very popular in our culture as well. So like a taco, a 6.5-inch taco, or the small, the corn tortilla, and then like an 8-inch pretty flat tortilla is going to be 15 grams. Of course, we have some really talented people that will make these at home. And so we want to make sure they understand the size and the thickness. But if these are purchased at a store, everything that's purchased at a store or sold at a restaurant is required by the FDA to have some sort of food label. So this information should be readily available to all people. One thing I want to point out on the bread is a common question I receive. Well, I was told whole grain was better. So sometimes patients tend to believe that whole grain means no carb, but our bread, all different diverse breads, white, whole grain, rye, potato, they all are going to have the same amount of carbohydrates per slice typically. If they are just a slice of bread on that food label, you'll see it's 15 grams. What we might be getting is a little bit more fiber with the whole grain or the whole wheat bread options. Same thing with our flour and our pasta and our cereals. Just want to make sure we're aware of that. It's obviously a better choice. We like it because it has fiber, which will slow that absorption of the glucose into our bloodstream. So we're a fan. We like whole grain, but there are lots of ways to get that fiber in if a person doesn't care for whole grain bread. Next up, we have some fruit. And I love to remind people there is no good or bad fruit. Fruit is a common misconception. There's a lot of sugar in fruit, is what we hear. But remember, carbohydrates turn into glucose, aka sugar, but it's not the white granulated stuff we cook with, right? So we want to be careful when we use that terminology that a patient is grasping that. So all fruit is good fruit. It has a natural carbohydrate. It has fiber. It has vitamins, minerals. So we want to encourage fruit within the diet. At least 1 to 2 times a day, we need some fruit. But again, the portion is what's going to vary for families and individuals. Again, another example, we could have a bag of grapes and I say, oh, go have some grapes. That could look very different to each of us. So getting familiar with what a portion of 15 grams of carbs is what we want to teach a patient that, yeah, you can have a banana, you can have a grapefruit, you can have grapes. Just want you to know that we're going to count it on your plate. We want to be mindful that that's going to require insulin to be turned into energy. So some general rules I like to use would include like a tennis ball size. If we're doing a very quick education and we want to tell someone to eat fruit, we'll typically use the example of a 1/2 cup canned is going to be 15 grams, or 1 cup fresh would be 15 grams. So that's a real generalized, not specifically precise way to teach someone to learn portion management. Grapes, about 12 small grapes or 6 large grapes is going to be an example. Raisins are dried fruit. They were once grapes. I like to explain. So they, a smaller portion, 2 tablespoons. So common one I hear. I was told I can't have raisins. Well, don't put a whole plate of raisins. Don't grab 5 boxes of those little raisins at once. Just be mindful to understand it's going to turn into carbohydrate, or the carbohydrate is going to turn into glucose, aka sugar. Melon, berries, and then the thing we want to be careful about is juice, right? So juice, not only is it, we don't require it to chew it, our stomach doesn't have to digest it very extensively. So it's going to hit the bloodstream really rapidly, which means either we need to match up insulin with it, or we need to understand it's raising our glucose for like a low blood sugar. But the other thing that really varies with today's culture is the portion. So you probably remember a time when juice was not as readily available. I mean, in the 80s, we started to receive those frozen cans of juice. And so that was more of a, a prized commodity. It was not something we just drank huge glasses full of. We had the small juice glasses, and that small juice glass is about 4 ounces. Well, now I can go across the street to any Toot Toto and Pack-A-Sack and find a 24-ounce bottle of juice. Well, in a 4 ounces is 15 grams. So you do the math. How many carbs are going to be in 24 ounces of juice? It's substantial. And that is not any different from a real soda. So we always want to encourage people to eat their fruit, maybe not drink it. It's good to have juice around for an emergency, but it's important that we explain that to our patients, that the portion is what's become dangerous, specifically about juice. Next up, we got dairy products. This is a confusing one because it's a trifecta of fuel. We've got carbs, protein, and fat. So it's beautiful that we get all 3. And this is just from the cow. So we've got yogurt, ice cream, and milk products. So the protein is going to vary a bit between those. Obviously, we're going to get more protein from the milk. The fat, that saturated fat, is going to vary based on the percentage of fat in the milk or yogurt. However, the carb amount stays the same. So we've got 8 ounces of milk. Oh no, I realized I just had an error here. My apologies. I'll have to fix that. I meant to erase these right here. So my apologies. So milk is actually 8 ounces or 1 cup of milk. Yogurt is 6 ounces. Thanks for bearing with me. And then our ice cream is not 3 cups. Our ice cream is a 1/2 cup. And I have a great example of a 1/2 cup for all my patients. It's a little scoop. It looks just like that pink scoop. And usually they say, oh, that's not the amount of ice cream I eat. I say, yes, that's why we're talking about it. So I want them to understand they can have the ice cream, but I want them to be mindful to have a filling and fiber-rich dinner, maybe lower in carbs, to then be able to enjoy that 1/2 cup of ice cream. So our vegetables are somewhat confusing. Like I said, there's a little bit of confusion with this, but vegetables are carbohydrates. They're also a great source of fiber, vitamins, and minerals. Some vegetables are more dense with that carb energy. I like to word it that way. Some vegetables are dense with more carb energy. It's not considered good or bad vegetables. Carbs are not bad. Carbs are part of our life. They're a structure we need. And also I want us to identify that these starchy vegetables are main resources for many people across the world. They're inexpensive. They are a little fuel, a little portion gives us a lot of fuel. So we want to remember that the good qualities to these foods. However, they are also a big piece of our current culture, and we are not deprived of food. So we tend to see larger portions of these particular foods. They're big staples for us, especially when we eat out. They're less expensive. So we're going to see more starchy items available on the menu versus the non-starchy. We like to call the non-starchy free because they are mostly fiber, a lot of water, vitamins, and minerals. So the portion goes further. They're not as dense with the carb energy. So there are no good or bad veggies, but we want to remember that beans, peas, potatoes, and corn are going to be your carb dense vegetables. So a 1/2 cup cooked is generally going to be 15 grams, a 1/3 cup of baked beans, a small baked potato. I wonder if I can find my examples. Hold on, pause. I'm right here. So we do a lot of playing with food when we come to class. But this is the size of a 15-gram baked potato. So, it's challenging to find them this size for home even, but essentially when we eat out, we're never going to see a baked potato this size. So we want to just have that visual in our head. I like to say it's about the size of a tennis ball because if I were to fold it, it would be about the size of a tennis ball. So the other thing I like to encourage patients with is really get these 4 in their head. Beans, peas, potatoes, and corn. It has a little jingle, and I make all classes say the jingle. I've been doing that for a long time, but beans, peas, potatoes, and corn. You can remember those 4 are just carb dense. So a 1/2 cup is generally going to be the 15 grams. And then when it comes to our non-starchy veggies, those free veggies, generally speaking, it's all other veggies. There are a few subjectives to that, but essentially most non-starchy veggies that are cooked, it's going to be 1.5 cups for 15 grams. That's typically more than most of us put on our plate. So we typically call it free, but it's important that they understand it's not completely free. And then those raw non-starchy veggies have really not been broken down at all. So 3 cups is going to be 15 grams. So those are all of our carbs. It's important to remember what's protein. So protein is going to be any kind of animal product, animal meat, animal product, and then we have our plant-based products such as any kind of nuts, any kind of seeds, beans, eggs, cheeses are going to be animal products. And some of these items are also carbs. We want to remember that. Like I said, the trifecta. Beans as well are going to be sources of carbs and protein and a little bit of fat. So it's tricky to get overwhelmed with information when we're trying to educate patients or trying to be mindful of all the things on a plate. So remember, I referred back to 1/4 of the plate has protein. Well, I remember a time when we used to say back in 4-H days in the 80s that half of your plate was protein. And we really learned with time that saturated fat is the most dangerous fat, and saturated fat is going to be in our animal products. They're holding hands. They're always going to be together. So if we can have a smaller portion of protein, we're not only getting more appropriately what we need for protein and for our body to process, but we're also getting less saturated fat. One other way to get less saturated fat would be to eat a variety of types of protein. Try to work in various types of animals, maybe less walking and flying animals, and maybe more swimming or plant-based proteins. Those are going to be your mono and poly fats. And then a variety in the cuts of the animal meats would also be helpful. And then a variety in cooking methods. Trying to vary it up between grilling, baking, steaming, frying even is okay, but it's the amount we're frying, right? The quantity of how often. Those are protein. And then just to explain fats on a real simplistic way is I like to consider the simplest way I can have a visual for a patient. And so feel free to remember this and use it. But if we can imagine Lego structures, both of these Lego structures are the same, right? Let me see if I can point here. So they're both the same. However, our unsaturated, those mono and poly fats, those are omega-3 fatty acids. They're what I hate to use the word good, but they're what we refer to as the good fats because they have such benefits within our body. We want to remind the patient that they just can separate really easily. It's like 1 chain, 2 chain, right? So we understand what that means, but it's best that the patient understands, okay, it's going to process in my body quite easily. And then a saturated, trans, and tropical, I like to remind patients that we really have increased our knowledge of fats in the last 15 to 20 years. So there was a time when we didn't know much about fat. Now we really understand the benefits of mono and poly. And what we understand of these saturated and trans fats is that it's more complex. It's more challenging for the body to break apart. I use this example sometimes. This is your saturated. This would be like your trans. And then also just in this Lego structure that we have to break all these pieces apart. So if we're doing that in large quantities in combination with our carbs, our body's having a lot it's trying to process. So trying to limit the saturated and trans fat. So then choosing those mono and poly fats, I like to explain that some mono and poly products have really great PR marketing campaigns. If you know, olives got it going. Those olive oil companies have really got it going. Sure, they do have a lot of flavors, so I totally get that. But you may or may not remember 20 years ago, we did not have olive oil as accessible as it is now on our shelves in this area. But we now see this as the cultural norm. We see these plant-based oils and plant-based butters and margarine blends. Margarine was, created during that era of creating the trans fat, which we thought was an alternative saturated, ended up being more complicated for our body, more damaging. So now the FDA requires every product to list the saturated and trans fat. So we want to limit those. We want to include our mono and poly and remind patients that margarine is not as evil as it used to be. It doesn't have that trans fat. It's more of a blend now of just a little bit of that saturated cow fat and then a blend of some sort of mono poly plant-based fat. So a few more tips before we dig in a little bit more is that sugar-free does not mean carb-free. I think it's very important we let that sink in. Sugar is a form of carb, right? It is something we call glucose, can be called sugar. But in a marketing perspective, on the label, sugar-free is referring to added sugar, right? So they're not considering all products, all ingredients from the product. So typically, if it's sugar-free, they've used an additional various type of carbohydrate option. So it's going to probably have the same amount of carbohydrates as the non-sugar-free option. It's so important that we are mindful of that when we make recommendations. Most people tend to get this. There was a big push of this in the 90s where people were really trying to promote their products as sugar-free. We have a whole new slew of interesting product pushes now, which I'm sure I'll get to, but carb-free is not sugar-free, okay? We want to always partner our carb with its best friend protein and or fiber. That's going to slow that absorption of glucose into the bloodstream, which means our pancreas is not going to have to work as hard if we're looking at type 2. It also is going to slow that climb for someone with type 1. Another thing we want to remember, specifically in our type 1s that are using insulin to manage the insulin to carb ratio, is that fat is going to delay the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream. I like to explain that it's like the queen, and it leaves the stomach first and everyone gets left behind. So once the glucose finally hits the bloodstream, that insulin may have already come through and not find anything and walked past. So we want to find a way to calculate our insulin based on that absorption of glucose differently when it's affected with fat. We also want to be mindful of that if we're looking at postprandial blood sugars with someone with type 2, and pairing that with, okay, what did you eat at this meal? It's possible that your 2-hour postprandial looked worse than it should have because it was just coming up. It hadn't started to come down yet, if that makes sense. So the food label, not a big fan. It is extremely confusing, just like Brittany's face down there. And our patients are even more confused. So we want to keep it really simple. We want to use it as a resource. We want to start with the serving size. And we all want to remember that that serving size is going to vary from product to product. We also want to take note of how many servings are in the container. We've had legislation passed that made this a little bit more understandable. It definitely was a little sneaky before, like half of a Snickers was a serving, but now we're seeing this is a little bit more reliable. So we want to know that in that 2/3 cup, right, is going to be all of this information below calories. But the thing we want to focus on is total carbs. The FDA approves total carbs is what we want to look at. These things are informative, but they are not the final decision. We want to look at the total carbohydrates as our everything that's going to turn into glucose within our bloodstream. So, are you guys ready to practice? I don't know if you guys want to unmute for this or not, but we're going to go through each of these as an example of a meal, and we're going to try to first identify which foods are carbs, and then we want to figure out how much grams are in each food. So all of this is based off fastfoodnutrition.org. This is a website I really enjoy and I recommend it often. It's nice because you can there are many different types of restaurants, not just fast food. And you can use a calculator to select the items you would have picked at a meal, and then it'll give you a label based on everything together. So here we have a very popular fast food restaurant that always has long lines. I didn't include their most famous item, but thought I would just keep it interesting. So we have medium mac and cheese, medium waffle fries, a medium kale salad, and a large lemonade. So does anybody want to take a guess at where the carbohydrates are? Don't be shy. Nobody's going to guess.
I mean, the carbs are often in the soda. The Oreo cookies are filled with carbs.
Sorry.
Grapes are sugar, and a sandwich is going to love carbs too, huh?
Yes. So in this first one, for example, I can't get this to go away. So the first one, for example, that medium mac and cheese, the waffle fries, the kale salad, and the large lemonade is what really does us in. So it's 149 grams of carbs. Remember, our goal was anywhere from 45 to 75 with patients. So I usually say 45 is the sweet spot. We don't want to have less than 30 at a meal typically, but we want to have no more than 45 to 75 range. So this is twice what we need. It's most of it is in this large lemonade for sure. There's really not much here. This is about 30 grams. This is about 30 grams as well. Surprisingly, they're not terrible. So it's important that we understand that. Next up, we have 2 cheese enchiladas, the beans, lettuce, tomatoes, handful of chips, salsa, large soda, which is a Coke Zero. Does anybody want to guess at how many carbs are in this? Hopefully you didn't see it when I accidentally clicked on it. Is anyone guessing in the chat? Okay, nobody's gonna guess. Okay, I'm gonna assume you all know then. But we're looking at 90 grams of carbs. Switching to a diet or a Coke Zero is very helpful in this scenario. We would have been at over 200 grams of carbs likely if we hadn't. But here we're looking at the tortillas in these cheese enchiladas. We've got about 30 grams of carbs in those two tortillas. The rice and the beans, remember a third cup of rice is about 15 grams, a half a cup of beans. These are all very generalized portions though, but we've got about 30 grams of carbs here. These are all free. A handful of chips is usually about 12 to 15 chips. That would be 15 grams of carbs. So we're looking at 30. So we get up to 90 grams of carbs. Our sandwich, we're talking about the bread, it's carbohydrates. Remember, a slice of bread is 15 grams. So we only have 30 grams in this whole exciting sandwich. We have a handful of grapes, 12 grapes is going to be 15 grams. We have done a real Dr. Pepper here though, so that's going to be 30 grams, the little 8-ounce sodas. And then 2 Oreo cookies is 15 grams. So sometimes we think this will be worse, sometimes we think this will be worse, but it's so important that we understand the variety in the food. So even if we just change this to a 0 Dr. Pepper, we would see closer to 75, even 60. So very good for attempting, you guys. So the way we're using carb counting and managing diabetes is this meal planning and consistency really does prove effective in the management of type 1 and type 2. When we have taught them the awareness of their foods and they start to see the relationship of how they feel along with how they feel with a stable glucose is very imperative to their acceptance and understanding of taking care of themselves. And then we want to really practice matching carbs with insulin. So whether you have someone that's type 2 on insulin or a type 1, obviously on insulin, we want to teach this practice of carb counting. I always feel like people with type 2 diabetes are at a disadvantage. They don't get quite the education that an individual with type 1, especially an adolescent, and their whole family begins to be exposed to this learning process. But we want to match 15 grams to 1 unit. It's like a good starting point. It varies. There are different calculations that can be done to get it precisely. And then we want to fine tune that. We want to use that data to fine tune a person's management to then improve their quality of life. So we're improving their quality of life by giving them flexibility with the foods they enjoy. We're also giving them quality of life of understanding that they can feel better if they manage more intensively. So that leads me into CGMS. I'm sure you've all seen CGMS at some point. Patients, whatever, wherever. It is the new standard, and when it was first created, it was overwhelmingly amount of data. Physicians, providers weren't quite sure what to do with all of that data. We went from having maybe 6 to 9 glucose readings at max a day for a person up to, every 5 minutes in a 24-hour period having a glucose reading. So we're looking at thousands and thousands of glucose readings. But in the last 5-ish years, we've created this standard of the time and range. And so this time and range is the new gold standard compared to the A1C. So we want to be knowledgeable in this, that it's 70% is the goal. We're not looking at 100%. If we can have as much green as possible, but at least 70%, we then want to look at our critical red, which is lows, and then et cetera. So if we have someone bolusing for carbs and we're seeing them climb after meals, we're seeing them going lower after meals, we can use that data to modify their insulin to carb ratio, or maybe their basals as well in different capacities. But we can really fine tune their carb to insulin ratio, which is, again, improving quality of life. The closed loop system, still relatively new and life-changing for individuals with type 1 diabetes. If you're not familiar, essentially we have this continuous glucose sensor, which is still a separate device inserted under the skin for 7 to 10 to 14 days. That information is then transmitted to the pump and also to an individual's phone or a cloud where it can be accessed by a provider at any time. Also, the information goes to the pump, as I said, and it can have a closed loop system of adjusting insulin, climbing and falling, which is life-changing for individuals. Again, you can have all that data collectively sent to your phone to review on a regular basis, also sent to a cloud that you can review yourself or with your family or with the provider. So this is the future, and it's going to hopefully just get better and better. But without carbohydrate counting, a lot of this is useless. We want them to understand the role of food in their body and the combination with insulin. Sugar subs, sugar alcohols, and net carbs. Oh my. This is something that there's a lot of hubbub about. Sugar subs, we want to just know the facts. They're okay. Let's not tell our patients they're not okay. Again, the portion is the poison. If a person's only consuming Diet Coke all day long, yes, that is most likely harmful for their body. But instead, we want to explain water should be our base. And then let's include other variety of unsweetened, diet, calorie-free beverages that can be enjoyed between water. Let's get that water, something else is a good practice to promote. But we want to remember these are all FDA approved. Any research studies that we might still be quoting are based on animals, and they were a much larger portion per weight than anything we hopefully are consuming in the amount of these items. So we want to just be mindful of that. Sugar alcohols, another conflicting opinions, specifically if we're dosing with insulin at meals. I think the overall goal and information we should give a patient is let's try to not feel like we need sugar-free in our diet. If there's something you love that's sugar-free, again, let's be mindful of how often you're having it. This is going to be like in candy, some different varieties of things, especially now with keto so popular. But we want to be mindful that this is typically going to be labeled sugar-free or no added sugar, and not a lot of other ingredients. So if there's a lot of this in the product and there's total carbs we're accounting for with insulin, there's a chance we might need to subtract some of that. Again, that varies based on opinions. Still some work to be done on that in the research field, but generally speaking, let's be mindful that we have a plan when we're talking to patients, that we're really maybe promoting just to eat the regular and count it, because it's going to probably cause bloating, diarrhea, discomfort if it's something they eat in large quantities. Net carbs, very popular in the last several years. Thank you, Atkins, and keto. Like I said, it's not new, but it's the world of marketing is just blown up in our faces, right? So everybody wants to lose weight. Everybody wants to try keto. And so what we do with that is we have these companies that are producing lots of products that are essentially the same amount of carbohydrates, but they put a ton of fiber in it. They maybe utilize sugar alcohols. So they've created something that's really nasty and really expensive, all promoted in the effect to lose weight. So it's important to know the term net carbs doesn't have a legal definition, which is like a standardization by the FDA, and it's not recommended as something we recognize or encourage within the American Diabetes Association world. So the FDA still recommends using that total carbs as the nutrition label. So that's what we typically are prioritizing when we do insulin to carb ratio with insulin pumps, with insulin, with bolusing for food. We want to make sure our patients are educated, though, that if it's a high amount of fiber or sugar alcohols, that it's likely it's going to have a varying effect on our glucose. So we want to be mindful of that if we're giving a large dose of insulin, right? So it's difficult to assume because there are different types of these ingredients used within the foods. They don't label these specifically within the ingredients, so it really can make it a difficult thing to just modify. So when this happens, you feel really confident about the carb counting that's been done, and then they test later and their glucose is really high, or they have a CGMS and they're just seeing it continue to climb. It's frustrating. So we want to just continue to teach them to learn, teach awareness of carbs, We want to remember to dose with insulin. We want to aid in the portion management. Let's check in with what our portions look like. Are we checking in with our fast food restaurants, our regular restaurants that we enjoy? But being mindful of that. We want to really discourage a restriction with choices. That can really develop a dysfunctional relationship that's very common in children with type 1 or even adults and type 2 diabetes. And so this creates a higher risk of eating disorders, anorexia, diabulimia, as well as diet yo-yoing, which can then actually be more harmful than possibly just having the food and learning how to measure it, right? So we want to practice mindful choices, encouraging them to listen to their body, honor their hunger, but also connect their stomach and brain versus enforcing shame or blame with patient choices. I want to end on a couple of things. We want to check in with ourselves that when we are talking with patients briefly about quick diet tips, that we're careful to not use something that's going to be more harmful than helpful. We want to find a better tip than these possible suggestions. Telling someone no carbs and to cut them out of your diet could really be more damaging than helpful, especially since we haven't taken the time likely to assess that person's individualized intake at that time of carbs. So we might be telling someone that sugar is consuming a moderate amount more than they need. They maybe need to cut back. But someone that's already eating rather appropriately amount of carbs, they're going to then spiral into even less carbs, which is then going to cause even more trouble. Let's try not to generalize and restriction certain groups like white foods. Instead, finding a place for everything on the plate. No fruit, no bananas, no cookies, cakes, candy, or ice cream, no burgers and shakes. When we restrict, we're leading to binging. So it's not going to be a successful outcome. So we want to find some ways to either encourage them to learn more education, or real generalized tips like I suggested: half the plate carbs, a fourth of your plate protein, getting comfortable and familiar with which foods are carbs, kind of securing that understanding of which foods are carbs and which foods are not. And this is the last thing I want to touch on, that this anti-diet culture, I'm sure you've heard some of this, especially in the adolescent community, this within the social media world, this anti-diet culture is really catching speed. It's important that we're on top of that we understand what this means. It's principles similar to mindful eating behaviors to better achieve overall health outcomes. Instead of just focusing on weight loss or body composition changes alone, we instead are looking at the person's entire quality of life, their functionality, and their physical well-being. Typically, when we just promote weight loss, we are actually promoting more dysfunctional relationships with food that are not going to be successful long-term. So instead, we want to get them in touch with someone to learn more about basics, helpful nutrition. We want them to reject the diet mentality, learn to make peace with food, honor their food, reduce that hierarchy of food as being morally appropriate or disproportionate. We want to find a balance of feeling their fullness, knowing their emotions, respecting their body, exercising, and having that gentle nutrition is what we call that. So it's important that this is a resource. I thought the infographic was nice, but just so that you're aware of this anti-diet culture definitely has a place in diabetes management. So then I have some really funny memes for you. I know I have an insulin pump, and so anytime I see one out in the wild, it's one of us, one of us, one of us. So it's important that we just familiarize ourselves with how far we've come in managing diabetes. So let's also come that far in the way we are managing within the diet world of diabetes, so that we are not encouraging restriction, but that we're encouraging to find a lifestyle of foods that are going to improve the quality of life, along with feeling better because their glucose is managed better. So then I have some reminders on the ADA standards of care for nutrition, that MNT and the DCES program, like I run here, are proven time and time again as very effective resources. So not to toot my own horn, but we have a very successful program. So if you have anyone that needs education, family education, we are more than willing to offer programs. We have free classes, free initial individual sessions, and then we also can bill additionally for MNT, which is that medical nutrition therapy. That's a billed service with private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, and here at Northwest, we're capable for all of those. And then a diagnosis code can be almost anything, but for sure, Medicare is going to cover diabetes, obesity, Medicare and Medicaid, diabetes, obesity, CHF, and eating disorders. So we get all of these types of patients, pediatrics and adolescents and adults. So this is the number to refer to. I've also included an example of this, which is our diabetes education form, as well as I think I included an example of our MNT referral form. But I tried to be fast, available to try to answer any questions if I can. Even if you want to email me or call me another time if I could be of any assistance. I know that we work closely with the Texas Tech pharmacy team and their students, and they help assist in teaching our class. I'm so grateful for them. And I know they also work effortlessly to try to get patients educated on diabetes information. And not that I'm not saying anyone else does, but I'm very grateful for the practice I have with them. So, and all the pediatricians and PD residents that we work with, we're just really grateful to have this team. And I'm glad to visit with you guys. So if you ever want to reach out and call me this number or email me. So that's all I've got for you guys, my good old references, but I'll stick around if anybody has any questions or wants to ask anything. Okay.
Hi, Amanda. My name's Susanna Jensen. I'm a first-year pediatric resident. I just had a question about when kids are first learning and parents how to carb count. Do you recommend consistency just to kind of learn the system, or would you advise against that?
I'm so sorry. I couldn't hear the first of that. Say it again.
When kids are first diagnosed and learning the system of how to carb count, would you recommend consistency? Like, let's try eating kids really like chicken nuggets. We'll do chicken nuggets and I don't know, some vegetable for a couple of days, and then we'll start making it more complicated, aka consistency.
Oh, okay.
Or would you recommend against that?
Well, I would just say it's very individual, and I'm sure Allison's here would agree with that, that you need to be mindful of the family dynamic, how that family is going to respond to learning, and you definitely don't want to overwhelm them, especially a newly diagnosed. Trying to keep it as simple as possible, get them continuously educated. You know, a lot at first, they're only going to hear about 30% of it, right? So I think if you can create a generalized meal plan to show them the examples, okay, if you eat X, Y, and Z, you'll see this is how many carbs you're getting. And so have them come back in as often as possible to review with the dietitian or the diabetes educator of, okay, do you see how things went with that? What are some other foods you like and you might want to add in? But also just letting them kind of explore that, I think would be helpful advice too, but it really would depend on the age, right? The family dynamic of how much learning is going to be going on, but trying to keep it as generalized and simple as possible when they're first learning. And then as someone is not in that honeymoon phase, they're more established with having a good knowledge of nutrition, that they then can work in more understanding of what's really happening when I'm pairing my fat and my protein and my fiber with my foods, what's really happening with that fat delaying my absorption, and how can I match that up better with like a dual bolus, etc. So not getting too intense at first would be my recommendation, if that helps at all. Okay, well, I know you guys probably have a lot to get back to.